This week we're going to be discussing Reconstruction. So, Reconstruction is what we typically refer to as the rebuilding, the sort of reunification, if you will, of the United States in the wake of the American Civil War. You have all, I'm sure, at some point learned about the American Civil War, which was waged between the Union forces and the Confederate forces uh, from 1861 until 1865. However, the reunification of the country after 4 years of being divided, of warfare between them, hundreds of thousands of deaths, was not an easy process. Uh, the Southern economy had been completely destroyed because of the majority of the fighting occurring in the southern states. You also have, uh, for a society that had um, used slave labor for so long, the now emancipation and removal of slaves from the Southern economy, was going to be devastating to the economy. Uh, so there needed to be a way to reintegrate the southern states. There's also the other major problem, and it is that for 250 years, there had been slaves in the South who had been uh, restricted of having any civil liberties. They were not allowed to have income. They had very limited or zero education. And now they're all going to be freed. How do you integrate this group of people into society responsibly, uh, equitably, and obviously the equity part of that is very limited. What do you do? And that needed to be a big question. So the period of Reconstruction was one that was very fraught, very difficult, and very contentious. So, as I say, these are our major issues as we move forward. And then when you ask about the different constituencies that are involved here, meaning who are the groups of people making those decisions, it's obvious that there's not easy, there's no sort of single consensus here. The southern states, those legislatures are not going to be particularly keen to treat former slaves well, while people in the northern governments, still obviously hold quite a bit of prejudice. So how does this occur? Um, and those are going to be the major issues moving forward. So, as I said, one of the big issues that occurred was, how do you reintegrate this group of people, former slaves, who had been for years, for centuries, locked away and not given any civil liberties or any protections? And the answer to that question is, you need to work with them to try and begin to exercise their political rights. So, starting before the end of the American Civil War, right? March 3rd, 1865. Beginning before the end of the American Civil War, you have the beginning of what would become known as the Freedmen's Bureau. This worked as a charitable organization to give money or assistance to newly freed slaves. It would provide food, medical care, education to newly freed African Americans. And it was seen as a way to give agency and freedom to Black people in the South. And obviously, for people who had for years, uh, their entire lives, seen African Americans as inferior. This was an appalling feature. So you have this sort of beginning attempt to give people of color um, in the South. You have some ways that they're trying to give more rights to newly freed African Americans. However, there was also a uh, massive push to try and limit those rights. So there was the creation of black codes. Black codes were new laws or laws that were enforced to try and keep blacks subservient in the South. Now, this also ensured that black folks would not be able to get more money and potentially move off their land. It basically was a type of subservience and new type of slavery, but slavery by a different name, if you will. It was a very harsh system, and it was really characterized by sharecropping. And there's a document posted on sharecropping. What this essentially did is this: your sharecropper contract would be a contract that you would have to provide a certain amount of crops each year. And if you did not meet that, you would be in what would be considered a crop lien. You would owe more money. So if you, in year one, didn't meet your requirement, you would owe a portion of that the next year. And then if the same thing happened again, you would owe a bit more. And you would constantly be in debt. So you were constantly tied to this land. Really, the point here is that although freed from slavery, for many African Americans in the South, their life had not changed a significant amount. And that's particularly true when we begin to think about the development of things like the Ku Klux Klan and other sort of vigilante groups that emerged to try and um, suppress and continue to suppress former slaves in the South. The Ku Klux Klan originally was seen as a social group, but it was really just obviously a huge, was domestic terrorism, right? Meant to any African American who tried to get a little bit more right, if they tried to vote, if they tried to buy their own land. This would be just a way to sort of continue to suppress, repress, and perpetrate really heinous, violent acts. The famous example, obviously, is lynching. And so lynching is the sort of group murder of a person by sort of hunting down a single person, chasing them, capturing them, and then hanging their body so that others see it. And it's obviously a terrible act of violence, but also it's a symbol, right? For people who view it, who see it, who see the body. It's a symbol that says you don't want to end up like that person. And you know, these actions continue to sort of make African American activism very difficult, right? How are you going to get mass movement of people when people are being lynched, violence is being perpetrated, families are being hurt, homes are being burnt? So it is very difficult, and these continued abuses really work, and economic abuses in the form of sharecropping and black codes, but obviously in violent repercussions as well. It's very difficult for people of color, African Americans, to really advance or even demand advancing, right? Because they're so fearful. But obviously, there's also there are other ways that they become advanced, right? Some do open businesses. You have in 1865 the first African Americans being elected to federal Congress, right? The Senate and the House of Representatives in Washington D.C. So there are certainly advances and certainly successes, but it's very difficult sort of on a day-to-day basis. The Republican Party at the time was divided, right? You had moderates who really wanted to bring the South back more peacefully, don't really punish the South, bring them in, and sort of patch over the major issues. The Radical Party, though, was one that was massively different, right? They really wanted to punish the South, and they really wanted to make sure that the idea of secession and civil war was really opposed, going forward. Now, there are a couple of big amendments that are passed, right? There's we call them the Civil War amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th. The 13th is significant because what it does is end slavery, and it makes sort of unpaid servitude illegal, federally illegal in the Constitution. You also have, obviously, the 14th Amendment. So the 14th Amendment is important because it grants all people born in the United States equal protection under the law. It gives people saying that if you are a person born in the United States, you have these rights. We call this birthright citizenship, meaning that if you are born in the United States, you get, no matter where your family is from, you become a citizen of this country. Now that is significant because for people who are formerly slaves, let's say this right, the slave trade had ended in 1809, meaning that every slave, or nearly every slave in the United States in 1865 or 1868, when it's passed, was born here in the United States. So this gives African Americans, gives former slaves citizenship, and thereby equal protection by the promises in the Constitution. This means that, the protection of the 13th Amendment is going to protect the former slaves, because they are born here. All of these things are made to try and give greater rights to former slaves. And these major issues grow the problems of Reconstruction, right? We're not going to go sort of through the nitty-gritty, it's covered in the text, but Andrew Johnson becomes the president after Abraham Lincoln is shot, and President Johnson, is going to work through the idea of, the South needs to pledge its allegiance to the North. They need to work to be part of the country again, but there's no real punishment for the South. But for many people, this was seen as far too lenient. So it was massively opposed. The other side of this is congressional Reconstruction. This was a far harsher form of the plan for Reconstruction. And that's where you get this sort of problem of Congress versus Johnson, where you have Johnson, who is sort of favoring this more lenient plan, but Congress is really pushing through a far harsher plan. The 15th Amendment, which I've mentioned a few moments ago, is the election that guarantees all black males suffrage, the right to vote. Again, this basically all men are allowed to vote in federal elections. It doesn't include women, white or black women. Women are not allowed, will not get the right to vote for another 50 years. And it's but again, it makes protection for them. Right now, there are going to be loopholes. Right, the South is going to make Southern states are going to make certain laws to try and prohibit African Americans from voting. So they make things called a poll tax. Basically, you have to pay a tax if you're black. If you have to pay a tax to vote, it would often be prohibitively high. Or if you're black, there's the grandfather clause, right? So if you ever have heard somebody say, "Can you be grandfathered in?" That's what they're referring to. The grandfather clause is if your grandfather voted in the election of 1860, then you are allowed to vote. So for former slaves or black people, right, their grandparents would not have been able to vote in 1860. So there's all these different loopholes that the South ultimately does enact. So Reconstruction, Reconstruction is fighting against a lot of, resistance, right? In the South, there's a huge cultural social movement to try and prohibit Southern African Americans from having any civil liberties. Because for 250 years, that was how their economy was based, and that's how their lives were based. And for 250 years, their entire world was based on keeping this group of people inferior and subjugated. And in the South, those ideas don't go away easily. However, within Congress, there is continued attempt to try to change that, right? So you have the Union League, which is created to try and educate African Americans on their civil liberties, but it's also supported by Republican candidates. So Republicans help to get more votes. And then actually as a result of that, you have increased the election of African Americans, right? So in 1868, you have black congressmen, senators. All of these things work to try and get more representation by African Americans. You also have new laws being passed, right? So you have the Reconstruction Act, which disenfranchises former Confederate soldiers, but it also establishes readmission process, and it requires that they accept different they accept the 13th and 14th Amendments. Finally, Reconstruction ultimately comes to an end in 1877. In 1877, the election of 1876, there's no clear winner for president. And in order to become president, Rutherford B. Hayes winds up sort of saying, if you give me your votes, I will end Reconstruction. In the Electoral College, if you give me your votes, I will end Reconstruction. That's called the Bargain of 1877. It happens, and Rutherford B. Hayes comes in. Reconstruction ends. That's the Bargain of 1877. This then instigates a period of what is called the Redeemer period. The Redeemers, right? This is a period when, in the South, there is a massive turn to try and bring back the old ways of the South. So I mentioned a moment ago that you have 14 African Americans going into Congress, state senators, all of those things happen. But in the Redeemer period, congressional districts are redrawn, and people from the South, black people from the South, will not be elected back to Congress. And in some states, it's not until the 1960s or 70s when another African American will be elected, right? So you go another 100 years without African Americans being elected. So that just shows you the sort of trouble that, Reconstruction comes to this swift end nearly 10 years in, 12 years in, and it really just sort of gets the clock rewound because of the sort of massive resistance to trying to change the 250 years of oppression that black people had faced in the South.